So students, we're going to be looking at logic and critical thinking, and as we start out down this road, it seems like it would be a good idea to look at a few of the things that get in the way of critical thinking. So even before we start to try to investigate logic and critical thinking, we realize that there's some things that get right in the way before we even can get out of the gate. So let's look at a few of those things together. So the first thing we have to take into consideration is just straight up selfish thinking, self-centered thinking. The little avatar of myself there, made out of Lego, I'm standing in front of what I call the Temple of Wisdom. It's modeled after the Temple of Delphi. And over that temple were the famous lines that Socrates continued to repeat over and over again. The Greek phrase is gnosthi seauton, which means know thyself. So one of the things from the beginning of Western philosophy is a focus on the need to actually examine ourselves, to realize that our perspective and our thinking and our views could actually be getting in the way of thinking critically and actually arriving at the truth. So we began the process of critical thinking by acknowledging the fact that our own thinking is flawed and prejudiced. Socrates is famous for his line, all men are biased and prejudiced, and in that he displays his own prejudice, which is that the only person that would be thinking critically and involved in philosophy would be a male. So we have biases and prejudices and just gaps in our knowledge. So the true critical thinker has to start with acknowledging and looking inward to acknowledge that I am not the sole arbiter of truth and I don't know everything, and it's very possible that I have mistaken understandings and opinions. So our self-centered thinking usually proceeds down one of two avenues. One of them is just simple self-interest. That is, when we're confronted with a question about what is right, what is correct, it's not surprising that we frequently choose the one that works out the best for us. So, for example, on climate change, Al Gore, years and years ago, was involved in a documentary called An Inconvenient Truth. And what he was basically trying to say, and this is years and years before this was mainstream concern, which was even though it is inconvenient to realize, we are affecting the climate, and that's going to have devastating effects on our lives and our future, so that we have to adjust to that piece of information. And what we do often, uncritically, is we will sort of assume that whatever is in our best interest is more likely correct. We give it an increased likelihood that that's right because we kind of like it, because it does what we want it to do. And then connected to that is this idea of saving face. Basically, it's just our pride gets in the way. So somewhere along the line, we said, this can't possibly be true. And then evidence starts mounting that it is true, but that would require us to say, I was wrong. And we just hate to do that. And so we'll continue in a false belief because we refuse to concede that we were wrong and acknowledge the new truth. So just being humble enough to say, you know what, I was wrong. Particularly among politicians, you'll see it's so interesting. They may have taken a position 20, 30 years ago, and then when people confront them with it, they simply refuse to concede. You know what? Yes, I believed that 20 years ago, but now I see that I was wrong, and I've come around to this new opinion. So those two kind of avenues are ways in which our self-centered thinking manifests itself. We tend to give extra logical credibility to things that seem to be in our best interest or what we just frankly want to do. And then we have resistance to changing in the face of new data because we will be embarrassed or humiliated. So the next step, or the next thing that gets in the way of critical thinking, is sort of an extension of self-centered thinking, and that would be group-centered thinking. So rather than everything being sort of what works for me, we sort of look at the big picture, we look at everybody else, and we assign extra value to something because other people or a lot of people accept it. This is, again, goes back to something that philosophers have been saying for millennia, thousands of years. Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. We must know ourselves. And then connected to that is this idea that we simply accept the views of those around us uncritically. That's why this course is on critical thinking. The great philosopher Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, is famous for calling the mass of people, he called them the hood. So that he said, people just sort of go through the motions and follow the crowd, and they're not critical. Just like a herd, they just follow whoever's leading. They don't even know why or who, but they just go along with the herd mentality. Thoreau is famous for saying that the vast majority of people live lives of quiet desperation. They just sort of go through the motions, and they're not thinking and examining the life. And so Nietzsche, he says what we need to be is what he calls Übermensch. And sometimes that's translated supermen, which is horrible. He means basically you have to sort of get up over the crowd and ask yourself, where are we going? Who's leading this pack, and do I want to be going there? Wendys did a series of commercials that sort of follows this idea. So I've dropped one of those in here. So it looks like I can't steal their commercial inside my video. So I put the YouTube tag there if you want to check it out. It's really funny. So all these people are just running into this hole, and the one Wendys guy with the red hair says, why are we doing this? I want a hot, juicy burger. I just not want to follow the crowd. It's a great series of commercials, and I think it's worth your checking out. So Wendys did an entire ad campaign. There's multiple versions of that where the person, whoever that Wendys person is just following the crowd, and then suddenly has this realization, why are we doing this? And so group-centered thinking, again, sort of has several ways in which it manifests itself. One of them is just old school peer pressure, right? Those people that are in our peer group influence us. And so we think that we should do as they are doing. Again, when you were a teenager, probably this is the bane of your parents. If your friends jumped off a cliff, would you jump off with them? And of course, it's a stupid analogy, but the fact of the matter is how frequently, if you look at a group of people, whether you go to a church or you go to a sporting event and you look around, it is astounding how similar people look. It's even interesting to me that people who consider themselves rebels, those people that are like out of the norm and they're going to be rebellious, even the rebels all look the same, right? You can tell them because they've got piercings or they've got whatever, purple hair. So they're going to rebel, but they all rebel in the same way. So one of the things we have to do critically is realize that many of our cherished beliefs and values and views actually conform remarkably to the people that we are surrounded with. Connected to that is the idea, too, that we give extra intellectual value to those things that are popular. When we want to know about a product, we Google it. And so we want to see, what's the best microphone for recording podcasts, or we want to know what's the best shoes for working out. But what we end up oftentimes doing is just simply finding out what the most popular item is. What pops up first on our Google search is probably what's been searched the most. It doesn't mean it's particularly correct or good. It just means that most people have looked for it, or it's the one that most people are buying. This is interesting too because a lot of times large corporations will buy up upstart competitors. Their product may actually be better, but they buy it and then basically shelve it so that it doesn't compete with their product. Although technically inferior, it's more popular, and so they're worried about market share. And then the other thing is just simple practice, right? This is if you've ever been involved in an organization, again, a church or a club or a school, what often comes out when you're thinking about something is people will say, well, that's how we've always done it, right? That's just how it's done. And so we just sort of roll with it and we say, okay, well, that must be right. That must be what we should do. And the critical thinker is we have to move to the question of not what is, but what ought. Now, there is a point at which practices are important, or social rituals are important. I'm a minister, so I perform a lot of weddings. Now, you could imagine if you sat down with a couple and you had a blank piece of paper and said, okay, who knows what a wedding is? Let's just make one. It could take a lot of time and there'd be a lot of stress in trying to invent from scratch what we ought to do, what should be done, the practice. Okay? So we have traditions that are there because they help us function so that we don't have to think about every single thing. But it doesn't mean that we should embrace those practices wholeheartedly, uncritically. So if I have a couple, and let's say, for example, that there was a divorce, and the bride is not particularly close to her biological father. She grew up with her mom and a stepdad, and so she's a little ambiguous about who should walk her down the aisle. Maybe, in fact, she feels like that whole idea of being given away is sort of nonsense in the 21st century. So there's no reason that you can't do away with that part of the ritual. And we can think critically about what does it say and what does it mean, and is it correct or appropriate or meaningful for me? So we have to realize that those are ways in which group thinking even prevents us from asking the question because we rule it as sort of inappropriate before we even start. So then we have to address the things that are barriers to our critical thinking that involve evidence. We're going to spend a lot of time in this course talking about what counts as evidence and what you can use to support an argument as you examine various issues that you are interested in. And as you begin to sort of look for something and somebody you want to find out what's right, and so you begin to gather evidence. And in the process of gathering evidence, there's two things that can get in the way. One of them is what's called confirmation bias, which means that since I hold a view about something, I will give extra intellectual credence to opinions that support mine. So what you will often find is people who have a particular political view will watch certain TV networks because they tend to have their confirmations, their biases confirmed, that they hold the same views that I hold. If I'm searching a topic about minimum wage, I could do a Google search about the value of a minimum wage. And now I'm going to be confronted with thousands of entries. Well, as I scroll those entries, no shock, I will most likely gravitate toward those articles that suggest that they agree with me already. So one of the things we have to do as critical thinkers is we have to be very, very conscious that we are seeking information and input and evidence from a variety of sources to sort of overcome our confirmation bias. And then connected to that is, oh, by the way, on that score, we're going to talk a lot about Bertrand Russell. He was a British philosopher who wrote a lot about logic and has several sort of really critical understandings about how we approach evidence. One of them is called Russell's teapot. And we're going to talk a lot about that to say that if you make an assertion, it's your burden to prove it, to have evidence to support your assertion. And you can't require that somebody else disprove your assertion. You have to mount evidence to prove it. And then connected to this, again, is this idea of resisting contrary proof. And sometimes in logic, we talk about a fallacy of moving the goalposts, or we'll talk about the no true Scotsman fallacy. And so what happens here, of course, is somebody will say, well, there's no example of X, Y, or Z. And then you'll say, oh, yeah, I do know an example of X, Y, or Z. And then they will say, oh, no, but that doesn't count. Or they'll have to figure out a way to resist the evidence to the contrary. Again, I'm recording this the day before the inauguration in 2021. As we have been through this political season, and particularly as Donald Trump has repeatedly argued that he won the election despite all evidence to the contrary, we have two things that have shown up here. One is the lack of proof that would support that claim, so that he repeatedly has gone to court, and over again, the argument has sort of been, where's the evidence? There's no evidence that the election was stolen, and there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. Now, what has happened is every time somebody has brought forward some counter evidence, then the Trump's people have then resisted that evidence, and they shifted to some other claim. So that this idea that you sort of I just don't want to hear that, so I'm going to go another route. The same thing on climate change. As evidence and science has mounted up that suggests that humans are actually affecting the climate, people then begin to say, well, yeah, but you can't trust those kinds of scientists or that kind of evidence, or we don't know for absolute certain. And we're going to talk later. When you demand absolute certainty, that's outside the realm of science. Science never gives us absolute certainty. Science only provides probability. And so we'll talk more about that later. But the thing that will get in the way of critical thinking is when we try to manipulate the evidence in a way that's not genuine and not sincere. If you're seeking the truth, you have to take whatever evidence comes at you, whether it challenges your biases, and if it's not really what you want to hear. And perhaps one of the most basic obstacles to critical thinking is old school laziness. It's not surprising that slothfulness is one of the 7 deadly sins, and it certainly is one of the deadly sins of critical thinking. The simple truth is that if you want to be a critical thinker, if you want to think logically, if you want to be deliberate in your assessments of the world, it takes work. And frankly, many people don't want to spend the effort. Now, there are times that I don't care. If somebody, my brother, for example, wants to tell me that Berno's Pizza is the best pizza in Louisville, I'm not sure I agree with that. I don't know what evidence we would gather to prove that's the case. And frankly, I just don't care. I don't care to invest the energy, the intellectual energy, to decide whether that is the best pizza in the world. If he's paying, I'll eat whatever pizza he says is the best. Or if we're going to pick a place to go eat and he says that's the best, well, let's just go. It's just not worth that to me. On the other hand, if, let's say, for example, in my family, we decide it's time to buy a new house, or it's time to buy a new car, or it's one of our children is getting ready to go to college, those decisions are very profound, and coming to some idea of what is better than the other is very important. And so it is time to invest time and energy into deciding what ought to be done. All right, now we come to the one that I get sort of the most worked up about. And in fact, I'm going to give an entire lecture on this topic alone. But one of the things that really gets in the way of critical thinking, and it seems to me like it's gotten worse and worse throughout my lifetime, which is this idea of relativism. So that what people will say sometimes is, well, I have my truth and you have your truth. And so everybody's entitled to their opinion, and so we should just agree to disagree. Now, there's so much crap rolled up in that. Again, I give an entire lecture devoted to this. But relativism gets in the way of critical thinking, because when you come to that thing that says, let's just agree to disagree, it's important to realize you haven't actually solved anything. When somebody says, everybody's entitled to their own opinion. Yes, you can have an opinion about anything you want. But when you claim that your opinions are true, you have crossed into the realm of logic and critical thinking. If you want to say you believe the moon is made out of green cheese, fine. I couldn't care less if you want to think the moon is made out of green cheese. But if you want to assert it is true that the moon is made out of green cheese, we have a problem, because it's not made out of green cheese, and that is not true. You can believe it, but it is not the fact. It is not the case. And so we're going to spend a lot of time really working through the logical problems of relativism. People say that, hey, there are no absolute rules. Well, the problem is that is a rule. So you just asserted a universal rule. There are no rules. So if there can be one universal rule, who's to say there's not more than one? So we're going to have to deal with all of that. But if you're one of those people that thinks, hey, everything is relative and there are no absolutes, then you're going to find yourself really struggling in logic, because logic asserts that there are many things that are the case, and there are many things that can be ruled out as illogical and uncritical. So we'll deal with that more later. But that definitely gets in the way of critical thinking, because when you begin the enterprise, if you already believe that there are no absolutes, then why would you even engage in that? I can simply just believe whatever I want to believe. Okay, and last but not least, as we think about obstacles to critical thinking, this is the one we have to call BS on. The most is what people call skepticism. So true skepticism basically says you can't know anything for certain. And so oftentimes that's sort of the last grenade that gets thrown into an intellectual conversation. Usually when somebody is clearly losing an argument, they resort to skepticism. And they'll say, yes, but you never can know anything for certain. And so the implication is that since you can't know anything for certain, therefore, if that person doesn't win the argument, at least they're saying there's no point in having the argument. And again, this tends to be the last hurrah of somebody that has a very weak intellectual position. And the real way you can test this is to say that virtually everybody I know functions daily as if there's a lot that you can know. when you go into the grocery store, and when you come out, you go toward the place you parked your car because you have a reasonable certainty that your car will be where you put it. Now, it's possible somebody stole it. It's possible that it's been towed away and repossessed. Or it's possible that aliens came down and took it, or that it somehow simply evaporated and appeared in China. So a true skeptic would say there's no way of knowing anything. So when they come out of the grocery store, they wouldn't know where to begin to even look for their car, because who knows? There's no way to know. But we actually function within a world of experiential knowledge that is the basis of inductive logic. We're going to learn about inductive and deductive logic. Deductive logic will actually bring us absolute certainty on certain points when certain conditions are met. And that inductive logic, in which base is the basis of all science, presents us with a world of reasonable certainty. Yes, there's places where we're not sure, particularly when we get into the realm of ethics, that things get a little more dicey because it's hard to know what the criteria is. But to simply retreat to say there's no way of anybody can know is often not an intellectual exercise. There is a position of skepticism you can arrive at, but that's a hard intellectual road. Generally, when it's an obstacle to critical thinking, it's simply thrown up as a barrier of last resort to try to duck the kind of the onslaught of facts and reality. Okay, so that's a good place for us to stop, or I guess I should say, it's a good place for us to start as we begin this exploration of logic and critical thinking, to realize that we have inherited from our parents and our school and our environment a whole set of barriers, roadblocks, that sort of prevent us from really being the kind of critical thinkers that we need to be. The fact that probably you got to this point in your education and never had a class in logic, the fact that you probably never had anybody lay out for you the basic criteria of truth and how it's arrived at and what inductive and deductive logic can do for us, is probably a testament that we really have not valued critical thinking as highly as we ought to. So those are the barriers, and then we will proceed through this course as you read and listen and write and think of the things in which get in the way of our critical thinking, and then once those are removed, we're going to replace those with a skill set that's going to enable us to be better thinkers.